We'll probably talk about Thursday.
Saturday, Capital Language, Did I own it? I mean, I own a lot of
You might have
Everything
This is the Ariel Kaplan.
everybody
Just maps.
quit.
Don't know.
Put them down.
Recommended.
Of everything you wrote?
I think there's 2 volumes of it, a lot of what he wrote, not everything.
Because
I
I
have
watched
one.
much already.
Eliminate them and they're gone.
Okay, I'll have to.
Your daughter is a very busy life then.
You've shared so much of your life with me.
Why do you sit over there?
My son is an attorney.
Okay, good evening everybody, good evening.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Welcome back.
My goodness.
So here we are again together. We've completed the 6-part series in the history and destiny of the Jewish people. And tonight we find ourselves in the present. And the goal of this evening is to look in the future. What's going to happen? What's in store for us as a nation? What's in store for us as human beings? We have here on the chart, this is something we mentioned in the very beginning of the first lecture, that there's a time span to our existence. There is a point where life as we know it began, and there's a point where life as we know it will cease. 6,000 years. And once again we said we're not going to discuss the first 6 days of creation. That we're going to save for the Judaism and Science series, which will be starting hopefully not the 8th, but the 15th. Tuesday, January 15th, will be the first of a 3-part series, Judaism and Science. And hopefully then we'll delve into the first 6 days of creation, what took place and how we understand it. But putting aside the first 6 days, from the creation of Adam, the first man, which was on day 6, till the very end of the existence as we know it is 6,000 years. And the Talmud tells us, based on earlier sources, based on the tradition the Talmud has going back to Elijah the prophet, that these 6,000 years will be divided into 3 time periods, each one consisting of 2,000 years. The first time period is referred to as tohu vohu, void, chaos, lack of structure. And as we discussed in our history series, that during that time period, there wasn't much going on. There wasn't much in regards to sophistication, in regards to spirituality. Year 2000, after day 6 of creation, which corresponds to the English date 1760 BCE, a man walks onto the scene named Abraham. When he's 52 years old, he comes to the realization that there's only one God, limitless, infinite creator of the universe. And the significance of him being 52 years old, we said, is because he was born in the Hebrew time, the Hebrew date 1948. When he was 52, that makes it exactly year 2000. And that's why the 2,000 years of the next period, referred to the 2,000 years of Torah, starts with Abraham, because that was the beginning of the Torah ideals and Torah philosophies in the world. Now, within this 2,000-year period, from 1760 BCE all the way until 240 CE, a lot took place. And we spoke about the Jews going into Egypt and that whole experience, and the Jews being freed from Egypt through the miracles of the 10 plagues and everything else, receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. After 40 years in the desert, going into the land of Israel, conquering the land of Israel, 14-year conquest, being in the land 300 to 400 years, having the period of the judges, then establishing finally through the son of King David, King Solomon, who built the first temple that lasted for 410 years. And then we had the destruction of the first temple, and there was a 70-year exile in Persia. The story of Purim took place then. Then they had permission to go back to Jerusalem and build the second temple, and they did that, and that lasted for 420 years. That was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 CE. Right before the year 240 CE was the writing down of the Mishnah. So it's very interesting. We see again how these 2,000 years are truly the 2,000 years of Torah, starting from Abraham's discovery of one God, leading to the whole creation of the Jewish nation as a whole, to our whole experience, more than 800 years in Israel, and then being exiled, and another more than 400 years back in Israel. Having the Anshe Knesset Gadol, the men of the Great Assembly, come together. There's tremendous Torah, there's tremendous scholarship, and that culminated in the times of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, who, based on his feelings that it was time to put the oral Torah into writing in order to preserve it, he wrote the Mishnah, and that was right around the year 200 CE. So that was the 2,000 years of Torah. The next 2,000 years, which I refer to as the last 2,000 years of our existence, the Talmud says these are 2,000 years of Mashiach, of the Messiah. So that might have meant that in the year 240 the Messiah would come and we'd have 2,000 years living with the Messiah. Did that happen? No. There are many false prophets, false messiahs along the way before the year 240, but the Mashiach never came. So what does this mean that these 2,000 years are 2,000 years of Mashiach, of Messiah? We mentioned briefly when we spoke about the beginnings of Christianity, some of the major differences between the Jewish perspective of Messiah and the Christian perspective. We'll elaborate somewhat tonight on that as well. But the basic, most simplistic meaning of these 2,000 years as the years of Messiah is that these 2,000 years are all part of a process that lead to the final goal. The final, what we refer to as Yemosa Mashiach, the days of Messiah, a time of clarity, the ultimate goal of humanity. These 2,000 years are part of that process. And we spoke about in the last lecture we had together something that was very intriguing, the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, which is right before, looking at it from the broad perspective, right before the year 6000. And it's very likely indicative that's all part of this process moving forward towards this time period of Mashiach. The truth is, in order to know what will be, what is destined for all of humanity, we could look back in the Torah itself. We have many sources that tell us that everything that did take place and everything that will take place is all alluded to on some level in the Torah. The Mishnah tells us, Hafach ba v'hafach ba dekula ba, which means turn it over and turn it over because it's all there. You have to know how to find it. But everything is in the Torah in some place. That's what the Mishnah tells us. The Vilna Gaon, who lived in the 1700s, one of the giants of his time, really one of the giants of all times, he says that even more specifically, everything that ever happened or will happen to every individual is not only in the Torah, but it's found in the beginning of Parshas Bereshis, in the very beginning of the first chapters of Genesis. It's all there. The Ramban, Nachmanides, one of the greatest giants of the 1200s, he says the same thing is true in regards to Parshas Hazinu. It's a part later on in the Torah. He says in that whole, which is not too long of a parsha, but in those sentences of Hazinu, the same thing is true. Every person's history and destiny can be found there. And the truth is, he had a student. The Ramban had a famous student who went off the derech. He decided learning and Judaism wasn't for him, and he became a powerful person in the government. And he was very angry. He lived a life of resentment. And one time on Yom Kippur, he actually summoned the Ramban to come down and stand before him to watch him eat pig on Yom Kippur. It's a beautiful way to celebrate, right? Come, let's eat pig together. The Ramban didn't eat pig, as you could assume. The Ramban turns to his former student, Avner, his name was, and he said, "Tell me, what was it? You were an amazing student. We had a nice relationship. What was it that just threw you off?" And he said, "I'll tell you. You said that every person can be found in Hazinu, in that part of the Torah. That's too hard to believe. I don't buy that." Now I have to assume that this was probably not the only reason he left. I'm sure there were other emotional issues as well. But this is one thing that he focused on. He said, I can't believe that. How can you say every person is found somewhere in that little parsha of the Torah? It's crazy. The Ramban said, ask me any question. I'll show you where it is. So Avner turns to the Ramban and he says, where am I in Hazinu? You can imagine if you're the Ramban, if you're standing in his shoes, the pressure you're going to feel right now, right? You got to come up with a good answer. So the Ramban thinks for a moment, and he says, it's in the verse, Afapeyem ashbisa me'enosh zichron. That's what your name is alluded to, which literally means, I will destroy them, I will disperse them, and their names, their humanity won't be recognized anymore. Referring to people who are clearly not doing proper things. And it says right in this verse, your name is alluded to, because if you look at every third letter, Aleph, Veis, Nun, Reish, Avner. Every third letter of that sentence is Avner. That's where it's alluding to you. Pretty good on the spot. So that's another idea we find, that everything is in the Torah. We have it action-packed in the beginning, in Genesis. We have it action-packed in Hazinu. But the Torah in general is the guidelines, the directions for what will take place throughout all of human history. We mentioned before as well, there's an idea of Maisa Ovo Siman Labanim, which means that which took place in regards to our forefathers is also an allusion to what will take place for the future of the Jewish people. Maybe one interesting example. The struggle of Jacob and the angel. I'll quote you from the Torah where it speaks about this experience. Jacob was left alone, and a man, referring to this angel, wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he perceived that he could not overcome him, he struck the socket of his hip. So Jacob's hip socket was dislocated as he wrestled with him. Then he said, the angel said to Jacob, let me go, for dawn has broken. And he said, Jacob said back, I will not let you go unless you bless me. He said to him, what is your name? He replied, Jacob. He said, no longer will it be said that your name is Jacob, but Israel. For you have struggled with the divine and with man and have overcome. And the end of this paragraph says that Jacob walked away whole. Although he had a bad injury, his hip socket was dislocated, but he came out okay. Comes along the Ramban, the same man we just spoke about, the great 13th century commentator, and he says, what's happening in this story in the Torah is not just a historical event between Jacob and the angel, but it's telling us what will happen to the Jewish people throughout all of history. And there will be time after time where there's going to be some form of struggle between Jacob, between the Jewish people, and between the descendants of Esau, the Germans. And it'll be a situation where there will be devastation. The Jews will suffer terrible wounds. But ultimately, Jacob will walk away whole. And you think about history, think about the fact the Jews, as a nation, went through the Holocaust. And we had this tremendous struggle with the descendants of Esau. And the wounds were unimaginable. But the fact that name was changed from Jacob to Israel, and right afterwards, like we spoke about in the last session, 3 years after the Holocaust, we got the land of Israel, which through divine providence, somehow that was called Israel. The people who made up that name were not religious people. David Ben-Gurion wasn't there. His mission wasn't to relocate the Jews in Israel to regain their ties to Judaism. That wasn't on his mind. But they felt, as nationalistically, patriotically, it's a nice thing to call it Israel. That's what it's referred to in the Torah. But just an amazing example of Maisa Ovo Siman Labanim, that what has taken place in regards to our forefathers is a clear indication of what will take place throughout all of history. The last thing we also mentioned, I think, in the very first lecture, is the Ramban as well comes along and says that every one of the 6 days of creation corresponds to one of the 1,000-year period out of the 6,000 years. So there are many allusions in the Torah itself to what will take place in the future, and therefore the question is, can we look at the Torah to find out what's going to happen in the future? It's one thing to look back in hindsight and to say, wow, this episode seems very similar to what took place in 1948, there's probably a reason for that. But can we go beyond and can we say, let's look now in 2012 and analyze and penetrate the Torah to be able to see what's going to happen in 2040? Can we do that? Jacob on his deathbed wanted to do that. He wanted to reveal to his children the end of days. The Torah actually tells us, and Jacob called his sons over and said, gather around me and I will tell you what will happen towards the end of days. And the commentators explain that he had the intention to tell them, when will Mashiach come? When will this period, not just the process of bringing Messiah, but when will the man, which we'll discuss shortly, when will he actually come on the scene and officially change human history? He gathered his children around to tell them this information, but then he stopped. And he totally changed paths. And he gave them blessings instead. And Rashi points out one of the greatest commentaries on the Torah. He says, he wanted to reveal the secret, but the divine presence left before he was able to. Which basically means God in his wisdom felt, I understand you want to tell your children, to let them know what to look forward to. And he had every right to do that because he knew that his children were going to be enslaved in Egypt. He thought it might be beneficial for them to realize that there will be a time, not so far in the future, in the scheme of things, where the world is going to be different. There's not going to be slavery, there's not going to be persecution. But God said no. These things are not supposed to be revealed. And this is a common theme that throughout history, whenever somebody tries to make the calculations, tries through different means of suggesting when Mashiach will come, when the world will change, when the end of days are coming, the sages, the rabbis, never look at that in a positive light. It can only cause harm. The best example of this, I think, was Shabtai Tzvi. The year 1648 was a year of tremendous hope, messianic hope, because in 1648, besides many predictions that were going around in the world, both from Jews and non-Jews, it was a time period not so long after the Inquisition, not so long after many expulsions, many pogroms, and throughout history we've always seen that whenever there's a lot of persecution, it always brings up those feelings of maybe this is it. Maybe this is the end of days and we're about to turn the corner to a new time, a new reality. Walks on the scene a fellow named Shabtai Tzvi, and he wasn't just the person, wasn't just the guy who wanted to be Messiah, but he was brilliant. By the time he was 20 years old, he had the title of Chacham, the wise man. He was clearly brilliant, and when it came to Torah knowledge and Torah study, he excelled amongst many of his peers, to the point where, at first he was recognized as a tremendous potential for future generations to really carry the torch of Torah. But after a while, some of his teachers got the feeling something's not right. He's not so stable mentally. And they distanced themselves from him. But who knows what exactly was driving him, what was motivating him. He probably did have some kind of bipolar type of issues. And he felt convinced, though, that he had a message for the world, and he moved to Israel. And there he found a man named Nathan, or Nathan, and Nathan convinced him that he's the Messiah. And I'm your prophet. Every good Messiah needs a good spokesman. We saw this in regards to Jesus and Paul, and the same thing is true with Shabtai Tzvi and Nathan. So Nathan comes on the scene and says, I'm going to be the prophet, and I'll be your spokesman, let's go together. And they were an instant hit. People needed something, people wanted something, and now they have this amazing person who was claiming to be Mashiach. Wow. And throughout the world, slowly, after many years, the charade went on for 20 years. People were convinced this man was the Messiah. Not just Jews, but even the non-Jewish world had their hopes up. This is the man. People sold their homes, their properties, everything they owned to get enough money to move to Israel and be part of the Messianic age. And he himself was doing pretty well. In the year 1616, he actually abolished the fast day of Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, which we've seen comes up so many times throughout history as the day of all calamity and all devastation, but he felt there's no longer a need for Tisha B'Av. The Mashiach has come. Later on, he got more carried away, and he actually did things that are explicitly forbidden in the Torah. He would eat non-kosher meat, and he actually made the bracha Matir Asurin, which means, blessed are you, God, King of the universe, who releases prohibitions. And once he started doing things like that, then at least to the more sophisticated crowd, they were pretty well aware of the fact that he was not the Mashiach. One thing that we know in regards to Messiah is they're not going to come along and change one line of the Torah. If they do that, you know right away they're not the real deal. The charade went on. He went to Turkey to try to convince the Sultan of Turkey that he should allow him to take charge of Israel because he was the Messiah and it's only proper that he should be in charge of Israel. And as you can imagine, the Sultan wasn't so happy with that request, and he put him in jail and basically gave him the option, convert to Islam or I'm going to kill you. And his response was, call me Muhammad. Okay? Game over. And the truth is, his real name was not Muhammad, but they gave him a special title, Aziz Mehmed Effin, the guarder of the gates of the Sultan, something like that. Now you can assume that at that point in time, most of the Jews who were still convinced this man was Messiah were probably now aware of the fact that he wasn't really the Messiah. And that was true. There was still a small group of people that held on tight and also converted to Islam. But by the majority, people realized he wasn't the man. But what this did was, you can imagine, you have so many, literally thousands and thousands of Jews and non-Jews who were convinced that the end of days was here. And there was going to be a time of salvation and a time of peace. And now their hopes were totally destroyed. How do you feel? You're devastated. You're hopeless. You lose faith in the religion. Which is an interesting thing because intellectually speaking, it doesn't make any sense. What should happen is, I feel I had hope in this one man. I thought he would be something that he wasn't. Okay. That's not going to affect how I feel towards Judaism as a whole. But that's not how we work. If we get excited about something in regards to Judaism, and then that thing that we were looking at as a source of inspiration falls apart, that affects my whole connection to Judaism. I'll give you an example. The Rambam writes, Maimonides writes in his philosophical work, the Moreh Nevuchim, he says, whenever you're discussing religion with somebody, and you want to bring them evidence to the authenticity of the Torah, make sure it's good evidence. Because if you bring them an example, if you bring them a proof, that's not a great proof. They're not just going to say, that wasn't a good proof, let me hear what else you have to say. They're going to come to the conclusion, oh, the whole thing's a farce. That's the kind of proof you give me, the whole thing's baloney. And I think it was a similar psychology here as well. If he's not the Mashiach, forget the whole thing. Take off the yarmulke. And then, therefore, it was a tremendous time of despair. Many people, based on this episode, said, you know what? We have to limit Kabbalistic study. Because a major part of what brought Shabtai Tzvi to these types of ideas and these types of visions was the fact that he himself was a Kabbalist. He was very immersed in that type of literature. And whenever you're getting into the reasons behind how things work and why things work, that automatically leads to these types of conclusions of Mashiach and what's going to happen towards the end of the days. And therefore many rabbis came to the conclusion, of course Kabbalah is true, it's authentic, as we spoke about in our history series. No one's going to debate that point. But it should not be the focus of anybody's studying because it leads to these types of things. And that's why for many years, Kabbalah was viewed as, no, don't bring that here. You want to do that? Do that by yourself. Don't be teaching it in public. That's why when the Ramchal came on the scene, or Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, one of the greats of all time in the 1700s, because he was into Kabbalah, because he had that interest and that brilliance in those areas, he was shunned. It wasn't until many years after he passed away people realized his greatness. But this is the danger of making predictions, this is the danger of getting people's hopes up, and that's why when it comes to us sitting around smoking a cigar and trying to think what's going to happen, when's Mashiach going to come, not a good idea. In the 3rd century, there was a pope that came with a declaration, and he said, I am proclaiming the Jews will never return to the land of Israel. You think about it. Saying that in the 3rd century, were the Jews in Israel at that point in time? What was happening in Israel? Nothing. It was a wasteland. Jews were already exiled twice. They were long gone. They're living in Babylonia. So to say that type of prediction, it's a pretty safe prediction to make in the 3rd century. And that really became part of the theology of the Catholic Church. The problem was 1948. Jews get back the land. What do you say now? And this is one thing where Christianity differs from Judaism, is that popes can't make mistakes. Rabbis do make mistakes, but popes can't. So the land is now belonging to the Jews, 1948. What do you say? So there's a declaration put out by the Catholic Church that it's true the Jews got back the land of Israel, but still the capital of Jerusalem is not officially the Jews, and that's what the original declaration was referring to. Whew. Okay, you're good to go. Problem is 1967 comes along,
Good luck.
and they get Jerusalem. What do you say now? Public announcement comes out from the Catholic Church. You should realize Jerusalem we view as the center of all major religions. It's not any one religion's capital. It belongs to everybody. But you see from that a little bit of a glimpse into the fact that when you make a prediction, it's not so easy for it to come true. The only way for it to come true is by saying something very vague and cryptic that doesn't make any sense, and then only in hindsight you can look back and say, oh, maybe that's what Notre Dame was referring to. But real predictions are very difficult. We have predictions in the Torah, and we've spoken about many of these throughout the last 6 lectures. The idea of the fact that we're going to be an eternal nation, the idea that we're going to be dispersed amongst the world, the idea that the land of Israel will be devastated, the idea that there's going to be anti-Semitism forever, the idea that we're going to stay small in number, and ultimately the idea that after 2,000 years of exile, we're going to return to the land of Israel. Now these are also predictions, but these are not made predictions. These are predictions with a valid source. We know the source is valid because it's coming from the Torah. It's coming from the blueprint of creation, coming from the manual given by the creator of creation. And we've seen these come true throughout the centuries. But to go ahead and make predictions is very dangerous. When it comes to Mashiach, when it comes to the Messiah, the man himself, what is the Jewish perspective? We've already spoken about the fact we don't consider the Messiah godlike. We don't consider the Messiah supernatural. The Jewish perspective is he will be a normal human being, born of mother and father, will live and will die. But what makes this person Mashiach is the fact that he's going to be a great leader, and through his leadership, the world will become a different world, not supernaturally speaking, not mystically speaking, but practically speaking. There's going to be more clarity. There's going to be more of a common vision, and that's what the Messiah will do. Some of the examples of what the world will be like during those times. One example we have in the verse, in Yeshaya and Isaiah, the nation shall no longer lift sword against other nation. There's no such thing as war. Not because it's a miracle, but because when all human beings have the same clarity of purpose, mission, and the same perspective of God, and the goal of the 71 versions is no longer out there, there's not going to be war. We also find sources that there's going to be a higher level of clarity. We have a verse that says the whole world will be filled with knowledge. We have a source that says life will be easier in general. I don't have to work as hard to try to make a living. Once again, not necessarily miraculous, but it's going to be a different climate. It's going to be a different mentality. I was telling somebody recently when I moved from New York to Florida, I was so shocked what a different mentality everybody has. You could be sitting there at the traffic light, and it turns green, and you might miss it for the first 2 seconds, and they don't honk you. They wait for you to realize, hey, it's a green light, and you come to the conclusion on your own, and you're able to go forward without being honked. It's a wonderful thing. The guy told me, he's like, I came from Tennessee. Here, people are vicious. So I guess it all depends on where you're coming from, what your perspective is. Coming from New York, people in Florida are very laid back. But that's what life will be like. In some level, the entire world will be like Boca Raton. God forbid.
I don't know if that's a good thing.
Some other source we find is that the temple will be rebuilt. Right now it's hard to imagine the place where the temple used to be. We have the mosque. But one of the things that will happen during the times of Mashiach, that the temple will be rebuilt on the Temple Mount. And the question is, these are all wonderful things. How do we know who this man is? Throughout the centuries, many people have made many mistakes in regards to who is this man, who is the Messiah, who is Mashiach. And not just lowly people, but great people made that mistake. We spoke about Rabbi Akiva coming to the conclusion that the man Bar Kochva was the Mashiach. And he realized later he was wrong. So how do we know? The basic idea is that the Messiah is not going to do miracles. He's not going to walk on water necessarily. He's not going to perform crazy supernatural events. What the Messiah will do is create a world of peace, bring this knowledge and clarity into the world. That alone will be a clear indication that he's the Messiah. I want to read to you, this is a translation of the Rambam of Maimonides, translated by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, discussing how will we know that the Mashiach is truly the Mashiach. He writes, we may assume that an individual is the Messiah if he fulfills the following conditions. He must be a ruler from the house of David, meaning from the Davidic dynasty, immersed in the Torah and its commandments like David, his ancestor. So number one is he has to be a pretty pious person. He's into learning, he's into doing acts of kindness. He must also follow both the written and the oral law. He can't come along the scene and say, we're going to start doing things differently. If you do that, that's an automatic red flag, you're not the guy. Lead all the Jews back to the Torah, meaning his main goal will not just be the security of Israel, but it will be much deeper than that. I want to help bring the Jewish people back to a Torah lifestyle, strengthen the observance of its laws, and fight God's battles. If one fulfills these conditions, then we may assume that he is the Messiah. It's a valid assumption. The Rambam continues and he says, if he does this successfully, and then rebuilds the temple on its original site and gathers all the dispersed Jews, then we may be certain that he is the Messiah. I've heard that perhaps the biggest miracle that will take place in regards to who the Messiah will be is that all the Jews will agree this one man's the Messiah. That will be the greatest miracle. If you have that, then there's no doubt he is the real deal. So these are some of the requirements needed for us to know who he is. It seems like from the simple interpretation of this source that the world is 6,000 years and that this time period is the 2,000 years of Messiah. And it's all the progression leading up to the actual man, which creates this whole different universe. That experience will take place before the year 6,000, before the year 2,240. That's not that far from now. About 230 years. What happens in the year 6,000? Then what? So the Rambam tells us that the times of the Messiah, the times of this clarity that will be created in those days, will last for thousands of years. People will live and people will die. Life will go on as normal. But the main goal, explains the Rambam, and here I think is the main point, which is somewhat confusing, but it's very, very profound. The point of Messiah coming is not an end unto itself. It's a means to an end. We don't do the mitzvos and the commandments to eventually get to Mashiach, and then once the Messiah is here, okay boys, let's just relax, get in the lawn chairs and the iced teas and game over. That's not the goal of Messiah. The goal of Messiah is to help us in what we're already trying to do right now. The Rambam writes elsewhere, Maimonides says that the main benefit of having Messiah come will be that we're no longer under the subjugation of other people. We'll have free reign. And not just we're going to have more liberties and the ability to vote and the ability to participate in society. He wasn't referring to that. But the way he says it is, we'll have the ability to immerse ourselves in spiritual pursuits. It's a very different perspective on Messiah than perhaps the normal perspective. It's just making life easier to do those things we're trying to do already. That's why we want Messiah. And sometimes we'll even hear, even in Jewish circles, that everything is for Mashiach. Once Mashiach's here, then we're good to go. The goal of the mitzvahs, the goal of delving into Torah learning and Torah observance is not to bring Mashiach. We look forward to that time because that'll make our main goal that much easier. That's the basic perspective. What comes next? This is all very worldly. This is all still keeping things basically the way they are. There's a period then of Techiyas HaMesim, which literally translated is the resurrection of the dead. Now this is a hard concept to get our heads around. I was in a Reform temple, and I was looking through the prayer book, and I saw in their Amidah, in their silent prayer, the blessing where the authentic one, the classic one written by the men of the Great Assembly, in the beginning of the Second Temple, the way it ends is, "Blessed are you, the Master of the universe, Mechaye HaMesim," which means, who will give life to the dead. They take that out, and they have in their Siddur, Mechaye HaKol, which means, who gives life to all. A lot more neutral. We're not necessarily saying that you're going to resurrect the dead. That's something I have a hard time with. So we'll kind of rearrange it and just say you constantly give life to all things, and then that's beautiful. Okay. So I was curious. I saw obviously the classic Siddur that's been around for many, many years. I saw the Reform Siddur, it totally changes the blessing. So I wanted to find the conservative Siddur. What do they say? So I found one, and they actually have two versions. They have the option of the classic way, where it says, who resurrects the dead, and they also have the newer option of just saying the generic, who gives life to all. The idea of resurrection of the dead, although superficially is somewhat hard to really feel comfortable with, it seems to be one of the basic beliefs of a Jew. When the Rambam delineates the 13 principles of faith, the 13 things that he feels are the core beliefs of Judaism, resurrection of the dead is one of those 13. So what does that mean? What is that going to look like? It doesn't mean that the body will just come out of the ground looking pretty similar to what it was before, wearing the same clothes or different clothes. That's not what it means. It means that there will be an existence of spirituality and physicality together in the same world, and that existence is referred to as the resurrection of the dead. As it is now, there's two states, so to speak. We have a state of this physical, finite realm, which is basically physical. Obviously, we're all spiritual in essence, but by and large, this is a physical existence. When a person passes away, the Jewish perspective is that the body is laid to rest. The physical aspect of who we are is no longer alive, but the essence of that individual lives forever. And therefore, that person lives on in a spiritual realm. I read an amazing article recently in Newsweek of a doctor who was always very skeptical about these types of stories. You seen this article? And always made fun of people who would say they had some kind of outer body experience. And being a neurologist, he was very aware of the fact of what the brain could do. You saw that article?
He wrote a book?
He wrote a book about it, right.
Yes, I
Right.
read the book.
I think the article was just like a part of the book.
I saw one on Fox News.
Really? Okay. Listen, you always have to be skeptical of these types of people and these types of stories. I'm never going to vouch for anyone. But I did think it was interesting reading that article. A lot of the things that he describes are pretty much quotations of the sources that we have that describe life after death. It was shocking. I should have brought it with me to read you some of the things he says, but the idea of life after death is indeed a Jewish concept. When I was in Hebrew school, I remember it was not a religious Hebrew school, and I remember very clearly I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and I asked the question, do we believe in life after death? And the teacher turns to me, I remember he said to me, Noah, this is Jewish school. We don't believe in these types of things. And I thought, oh, okay.
Wow.
Only later on did I realize that
It's true.
there's a lot of Jewish literature out there that speaks about these types of things. It's one of the basic perspectives in life that we have. So the idea that here is a physical realm, when the body is laid to rest, the spiritual existence of who we are lives on forever, is indeed a Jewish philosophy. The world of the resurrection of the dead is an interesting combination of both of these, where it's not just the spiritual, but it's not just the physical. It's a conglomeration of both, which is pretty much what life was like. Once again, we're not going to get into the 6 days right now, but the creation of the Garden of Eden, that whole experience with Adam and Eve, that's how we picture life during that experience. It was much like life will be during the resurrection of the dead, where there is physicality, but it's not nearly what it is right now. So to actually picture these things is impossible. Maimonides writes that when it comes to thinking of these types of ideas, it's like you're speaking to a person who was born blind and trying to explain to them what does purple look like. There's no way, there's no words I have to describe what purple is if you've never seen colors in your life. He goes on to say, if a person's born without the ability to hear, how do you describe to somebody what it means to hear? I don't have that sense. The same thing is true when it comes to the spiritual realms the Rambam tells us. We're not living there. It's a whole different reality. It's a whole different plane of existence. So we can't even picture what it looks like. We could say words, but words are meaningless. But at least I have the basic idea that this 6,000 years is a cutoff point to the world as we know it, to existence as it is now. Mashiach will come some point before this time. In the next 230 years, the assumption is Mashiach will come. And that can last 1,000 of years, which will still be somewhat life as we know it. But at some point in time, we're going to transition to this next phase, which is off the board. That next phase is referred to as the resurrection of the dead, where we have this very intriguing combination of physical and spiritual. That, in a nutshell, is what we have to look forward to. Any questions up until this point?
Oh, yes.
Please feel free to ask if you like.
Okay.
That's a seltzer.
Sure. So we believe in the spirit, the neshama existing. Do we believe in communication with that, or is that sort of the unknown?
Communication meaning somebody here in this realm being able to communicate with.
Yes.
So the truth is we have a prohibition in the Torah. The Torah speaks about the practice of communicating with the dead.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting debate amongst the early commentators as to what does the Torah mean by that. Is the Torah saying, obviously there's no such thing. Obviously you can't really communicate with the dead.
Mm-hmm.
They're in a whole different realm. There's no way for us to connect. It's just saying don't try to do those practices of the other nations. Or is the Torah saying there's something real. There is a way to communicate with people who are no longer in this world. But don't do it. One of the famous stories we have of King Saul. King Saul, towards the end of his life, trying to find out what his destiny would be in the upcoming battle, he went to somebody, a necromancer, that's the translation of it, and tried through her to communicate with the dead. And the simple interpretation is that there is such an existence, there is such a reality of that, but we're not supposed to do it.
I understand that, but I've talked to certain people and they've told me, although I've never had the experience, they've had a loved one that's passed away. I mean, something that was very vivid. A friend of mine lost her father, and she was sleeping one night, and she woke up and supposedly saw her father in the room. She looked at the clock, and that was to the minute. I mean, this is a very... She was quite observant. I mean, she saw her father saying goodbye. I mean, you hear stories like that. And this story you're talking about, this doctor who almost died, I was rethinking a book of one of the first lectures I was here about one of the rabbis from Aventura told me about a book to read of this Jewish psychologist who had a patient who transformed to these different lives and different existences, and he said, I didn't believe it until, you know, that came through. The same thing with this doctor, and all his doctor friends now are poo-pooing, says, you couldn't have experienced that, there's no such thing. But...
Right, I mean, there is an important distinction in regards to actively trying to communicate.
No, I didn't say that.
Right, right.
I didn't
But
mean that.
100%, we do have many sources, not just from people who tell us their experiences, which,
Yes.
listen, you have to assume everyone's telling the truth. Now,
Yes.
whether or not that experience was a supernatural experience or was
Or
it just,
accurate.
it's hard to know. But we do have many sources, even in the Talmud, of these types of situations where somebody has a dream and it was clearly some kind of communication with a loved one, and that
I've been told this many times by many people.
Does that correspond in some way with the Christian idea of the resurrection of Christ, looking forward towards that? Is that corresponding in some way to the Mashiach coming into being at some point?
I mean, it's very likely that the fact they believe in the resurrection comes from the basic Jewish belief
That's right.
of
Right.
the resurrection in general. We clearly don't believe that this one man will be resurrected again for the second coming. All that we don't believe in, but a lot of their basic beliefs they got from classic Torah theology.
But yet you talk about the common man being the Mashiach. Isn't that what you had indicated?
So it could be that the normal, when I say common, there's a difference between normal and average.
Okay.
Normal means mortal, not supernatural.
Not a deity either.
Not a deity, right?
Yeah.
We don't believe in saints. That's not part of our religion. You're either human or you're God. But it's not
Or
going to
an
be an
angel.
average fellow or an angel. We can say that for a difference. That's also a very interesting discussion, angels.
I'd like to get into
We'll
that.
get there. Hopefully we'll get there. But it's not going to be an average fellow. He's not going to be just a run-of-the-mill type of guy,
Not Joe
working
the
9
plumber.
to 5. The way the Rambam tells us is he's going to be immersed in Torah study and he's going to be living a lifestyle of Torah values. So he's going to be normal in the sense where he's going to be mortal,
Mortal.
but he's going to be a very impressive person.
How about someone like you,
I can't share with you why I can't be Mashiach. But there are many reasons why.
That would be nice.
But there are a lot of concepts that you just brought up that are very similar to what you're doing.
If you knew me better, you wouldn't have that question.
So, can you explain the concept of, the two Mashiachs, Ben David and Ben Yosef? Like, where is that? I never understood that. I never understood.
So the truth is that itself is a debate. That's not so clear. There's an idea, we have a source that the Mashiach ben David, the Mashiach from the dynasty of David, will be the Mashiach. He'll be preceded by Mashiach ben Yosef, also a wonderful leader from Joseph. And he's actually going to die in battle. That's the tradition that we have. But that will somehow make way for the Mashiach, the descendant of David. Now, some of the early commentators don't believe in the whole thing. Some people are of the opinion there's one Mashiach just from the Davidic dynasty and that's it. But that idea you're talking about is referring to Mashiach from Joseph, who will be more of a general type of figure, die in battle and make way for the Mashiach.
Not like Shimshon, because he was Ben Yosef.
Oh, an interesting connection.
And he was kind of like a messianic figure, candidate, maybe not Mashiach, but...
I hear that. Interesting connection. Do you have a question over here?
Interesting.
Okay. So obviously there's a lot of esoteric ideas over here. The main thing to keep in mind is that when we therefore see in the Siddur, Mechaya HaMesim, we refer to God as the one who resurrects the dead, we shouldn't take the approach of, I don't understand it, let me change it. That's not how we view Judaism. The goal is, I don't understand it, not, I have to accept it. That's also not Judaism. It's the middle ground where I don't understand it, let me ask questions. Let me probe deeper. Let me try to understand what's going on. What in the world does that mean that God's going to resurrect the dead? But the way we're explaining it, based on many different sources, is that it's going to be this conglomeration of physical and spiritual together. And that's going to be, now will that time last forever? Is that going to be the eternal state of humanity? Once we get back to that original environment of Adam and Eve, which is going to be the resurrection, that's going to last forever? That's going to be our eternal connection with God? Or is that going to stop at some point also?
Wow.
Well, isn't that the idea where you are breaking up those periods into 2,000 years?
Right.
So are are you then saying that there will be another period of a 2,000-year period, or is that something you're just mentioning, that it's ad infinitum?
So, well, basically, we're saying right now we're about over here, almost towards year 6,000. The assumption is based on this, that Mashiach will come some point before 6,000. Let's say right over here. Let's say the Mashiach will come in 200 years from now. Now, that period of Mashiach, the Rambam tells us, will last thousands of years. More than 2,000 years, it sounds like. But that period will still be somewhat normal, somewhat what life is now. The question is, that period will eventually have a transition into what we refer to as the time of the resurrection. Now, is that the last period? That last step of resurrection, the physical and spiritual together like the Garden of Eden, will that last forever? Or is that also limited?
Wow. Who knows?
Who knows? Well, yeah, go on. Yeah.
There's something that I read about that was really interesting. I think it was by maybe Ari Kaplan, I'm not sure. But it's a very common concept in Judaism, how he likens the 6,000 years to the days of the week, and then the last period being Shabbos.
Oh,
yeah,
that's based on the Ramban.
Yeah,
right. Meaning every one of the 6 days of creation is one of the 1,000-year period.
1,000-year period.
And then after 6,000 years, we go into Shabbos. We go into that time of peace and rest. That's why, perhaps, one could say homiletically that as we get closer to Shabbos, things get more stressful. Friday afternoon, you're getting ready for Shabbos, it's always a rush, it's always stressful. But that's the interesting question. Will that final period of the Chiyas HaMeisim, the resurrection, last forever, or is that also limited? And once again, here's always a good thing to keep in mind. Whenever somebody asks you a question, what is the Jewish perspective on anything? The best answer is, it's a machlokas. It's a debate. Different opinions. There's always different opinions. And this is no exception. Some are of the opinion, the Ramban, the Ramchal, many of the great Kabbalistic sources, that this period will last forever. This will be the ultimate infinite connection between human beings and the creator of the universe. Others are of the opinion, the Rambam, Maimonides, that he feels this is also going to have a limit, and the ultimate connection that will be forever will be totally spiritual. Now, these nuances, how much of a difference do they make in our lives? Not that much. Interesting to be aware of some of these concepts, but your question about it.
So what are we looking forward to? Is there anything in the next 240 years or so that has been predicted that we should be concerned about, or is there any significant events that have been forewarned?
So we do have in the prophets, in Ezekiel, the discussion of Gog and Magog, which is a major war that's supposed to precede the times of Messiah, the times of clarity. Now, what is that major war referring to? Did it happen? Was that World War II? It could have been. The Rambam, in his commentary to Ezekiel, when he discusses what exactly will this war look like, when will it take place, who's going to be fighting, his response is, don't waste your time. It's not going to help us in our spiritual growth to know exactly all the details, and ultimately it'll just diverge us and cause us to be confused. So it's hard to know if that war already took place. Hopefully the answer is yes.
Yeah.
But we'll know when we get there.
So if year 6,000, by that time we're predicting that Mashiach will be here or will coming or whatever, why are we doing anything today? I'm saying, why don't we just sit back and relax? Let's say Mashiach's not going to be me. I'll give you that, right?
You never know.
So,
okay.
Right, let's assume that.
Okay.
So why am I doing anything? Why don't I just relax and get out of the lawn chair, like you said?
Good question. Chafetz Chaim, one of the great rabbis of the 19th century, died in 1933. He said as follows. He said that no matter what we do as Jews, that period will come. He said, towards the end of days, and I hate using that term because it's very Christian, you'll excuse me, but
yes.
It does come from our Bible. But,
yes.
So towards the end of days, says the Chafetz Chaim, there's going to be two major sections of the Jewish people. One section will be extremely secular, devoid of Torah knowledge or Torah relationship. And there's going to be another segment of Jews that will be grasping and trying to hold on. Like it says, Eitz Chaim Hi. What?
I can't picture that.
You can't picture that? Right? It seems pretty clear this is what we're holding right now. And he says, but both segments will be beneficial, will be helpful in the bringing of Messiah. Because they bring Messiah for two different reasons. When God, so to speak, looks down on the world and he sees all of these Jews who have no understanding of what it means to be Jewish, God's conclusion is, got to bring Messiah. We got to bring some clarity into the world because these people have no idea what's going on.
Straighten them up.
Straighten them up. And then, conversely, says the Chofetz Chaim, when God sees the other Jews who are trying to stay connected, trying to learn and be involved with Torah Judaism, so that God's response is, look at these people who are trying so hard, even against all odds and all forces, they're still trying to connect. Got to bring Mashiach. So either way, Mashiach will come. The question is only, what camp do I want to be in? And that's, I think, a very fundamental point. My sister-in-law is a psychologist, and she was meeting with someone, a very nice young woman, happened not to be Jewish. And she was dating a nice Jewish boy for many years. She wanted to get married, and he just wasn't asking for her hand in marriage, and a lot was because of the pressure of his family having to marry Jewish. So this lady came to my sister-in-law, and she knew that she was religious. She was asking her, what's going on over here? I just don't get it. We have a great relationship. He likes me a lot. I like him a lot. Why does his family have to feel that if I'm not Jewish, then that it's not a good match? It's killing me. So my sister-in-law gave me a call. She's like, what do I tell this person? I don't know the answer to that. It's a good question. Of course they love each other. No one's going to look at that and say, they don't really love each other, they're just fooling themselves. Love is love. So I told her, there's two approaches you could take. You could either come up and say, listen, you know, the Jewish people are diminishing, there's so much assimilation, there's so much out there that is causing us to lessen as a people. How could you not marry Jewish? That's one approach. It doesn't work, though. It doesn't work. If I were to get up right now and say, listen, you know, we have a terrible issue right now. The soy intake of most human beings by the year 2030 will kill all the white tigers. They live on soy. And if we continue eating soy at the rate we're eating it, there's not going to be one white tiger left by the year 2030. Will that make too much of a difference in our soy intake? No, because we don't care about the white tigers. Okay, we have many different types of tigers. We don't need white tigers, right? The truth is, a person who doesn't have an appreciation of Judaism, if you tell them, if you marry somebody non-Jewish, you're going to be affecting the Jewish people, that's okay. I don't mind. And it's not true. Not just is it not effective, but it's not true. Like we spoke about many times, the Torah itself predicts the Jewish nation will be here forever. As a nation, we're eternal. So I told her to explain that the only reason why we feel it's worthwhile marrying Jewish isn't for the Jewish people. They're going to live without you. It's for yourself. If you feel this mission is worthwhile, if you feel the Jewish people have a special place in the destiny of the human race, then as a personal choice, you should choose to be part of it for yourself, for your descendants, but don't do it for the Jewish people. And I think the same thing is true when we speak in regards to many aspects of Judaism, many aspects of, do I have to do anything Mashiach? The answer is no, Mashiach will come no matter what I do. But it's a personal choice. What camp do I want to be part of? Do I want to be motivating God to bring this period of clarity because he sees when he says, wow, look at how hard they're trying. Let me bring that period sooner than later. Or do I want to be part of the other camp where God looks at me and says, look at this, they have no connection. Let me help them get clarity. It's a personal choice.
So
Anyway,
is the Mashiach supposed to bring forth the perfect world? Is that what we're looking for?
so
And
perfect.
what is a perfect world?
Perfect, the way the Rambam describes it, is that war will no longer exist. It's not going to be perfect in the fact that everyone's going to be wealthy. The Rambam says that some people will still be wealthy, others will still be poor. Some will be strong, some will be weak. The normal conditions of life will go on. It does seem, though, that the amount of sickness that we have, the amount of stress that we have, those things will definitely be mitigated. It'll be a much better reality. And I think that the main difference is there's just going to be more knowledge and clarity. And that itself creates a whole different world. But it's not going to be perfect in the fairy book sense.
But you know that it's kind of contradicting though, because if we have the knowledge of God, like if everybody on earth is completely aware of God's existence, it's very hard to believe that there's going to be poor people, because everyone's going to want to give. Everyone's going to already know that there's reward and punishment, you know. So how could there ever be poor or those who are suffering? Because everyone's just going to want to share because they know now full well of reward and punishment.
That's a good question. I happen to think the answer is that when he says poor and rich, I don't think he means that there's still going to be billions of people starving to death. It's hard to believe that's going to be the case.
It's hard to believe that
right.
there's going to be.
Because there's going to be such a clarity and such a desire to help others. I don't think that's going to exist.
Right.
I think what he means is there'll still be different levels of affluence.
Right.
Anyway,
Does that mean everybody's going to be Jewish?
No, the goal is not to have everyone Jewish. The goal is that all humanity has a clarity. Those who want to become Jewish, let them come. But that's not the goal.
But bagels and lox will be in every restaurant.
Bagels
There
and lox
you
will always
go.
be there. Everyone, it's been a wonderful. For the next series, we're not going to be starting the 8th, it's going to be the 15th.
15.
Tuesday the 15th. Have a beautiful
Perfect.
evening. Take care.
Subject again will be.
Judaism and science.
That's an oxymoron.
Are they in conflict?
Somewhat. Oh, thank you.
Joe Schroeder, right?
There's a computer rabbi in Miami.
Okay.
And the girl went to him.
Interesting.
She was Jewish.
Interesting.
And now